James, pull over, please. That man is soaked. We have to help him.
Ma'am, I don't think that's a good idea. We don't know who he is. He could be dangerous.
I understand your concern, James, but we can't just leave him there.
All right, ma'am. But please stay inside the car while I speak to him.
3 days earlier, London was already awake. The streets buzzed with commuters rushing to work, taxis weaving through traffic, and coffee shops filling with customers. High above the city, on the 32nd floor of Hayes Group headquarters, Victoria Hayes stood quietly beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the morning unfold beneath her. At just 31 years old, she had become one of Britain's youngest CEOs. Business magazines called her brilliant. Investors called her fearless. Her employees called her fair. But only Victoria knew the pressure she carried every single day. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Hayes," her assistant Emma said politely, "the board meeting starts in 5 minutes." Victoria nodded, picked up a blue leather folder from her desk, and walked toward the conference room. The atmosphere changed the moment she entered. No one smiled. A large screen displayed falling revenue charts and declining forecasts. The company's biggest client, Westbridge Group, was preparing to walk away from a contract worth hundreds of millions of pounds. One director broke the silence. "If we lose this deal, we'll have to close 2 regional offices and lay off hundreds of employees." The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to Victoria. She looked around the table before speaking calmly. "We're not making decisions out of fear." Her steady voice settled the room. "This company survived difficult seasons before. We'll find another way." The meeting continued, but the tension never disappeared. As everyone began leaving, Victoria remained behind for a moment. Her eyes rested on a framed photograph hanging on the wall. It showed her standing beside her late father on the day Hayes Group opened its new headquarters. She could still hear his voice. "Success isn't measured by how many people work for you, Victoria." He smiled in the photograph. "It's measured by how many lives become better because you chose to care." Victoria smiled quietly. She picked up her folder and walked out of the boardroom. She had no idea that in just 3 days, those words would be tested on a cold, rainy London night. On the other side of London, far from the glass towers and luxury offices, a man sat alone beneath a weathered bus stop. His coat was old. His shoes were worn. The cold wind and light rain didn't seem to bother him anymore. Hundreds of people walked past him every day. Some looked away. Others pretended not to see him. To them, he was just another homeless man. Invisible. Forgotten. But they were wrong. The man's name was Alexander Sterling. At 58 years old, his face showed signs of hardship, yet there was something unusual about him. His posture was straight. His movements were calm. And his eyes carried the quiet confidence of someone who had once lived a very different life. A young man stopped in front of him and dropped a few coins into an old paper cup. Alexander smiled politely. "Thank you," he said. "But perhaps someone else needs it more than I do." The young man looked confused. "You need it more than anyone." Alexander simply smiled. "Sometimes what people need most can't be bought." The young man stood there for a moment, unsure what to say, then quietly picked up the coins and walked away. When the street became quiet again, Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his old coat. He carefully removed a silver pocket watch. It was scratched with age, but he handled it as though it were priceless. He opened it slowly. Inside was a faded photograph of a smiling woman. He looked at the picture for several seconds before closing the watch again. A single tear formed in his eye. But it never fell. Because some pain becomes so familiar, you learn to carry it without letting the world see it. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered over London. Rain was coming. And before the night was over, Alexander Sterling's life was about to change forever. 3 days passed. The board meeting was over, but the pressure on Victoria hadn't eased. Every proposal she submitted was met with another demand. Every solution seemed to create a new problem. By the time she left the office that Friday evening, the city was already wrapped in darkness. Rain had begun to fall. Her driver, James, opened the rear door of the black SUV. "Long day, Miss Hayes?" he asked. Victoria gave a tired smile. "They're all starting to feel the same." The SUV pulled away from Hayes Group headquarters and joined the slow-moving traffic through central London. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Victoria rested her head against the window, watching raindrops race across the glass. The streets were crowded. People hurried home with umbrellas. Restaurants were filling up. The city was alive. Then, the traffic came to a stop at a red light. Victoria looked out absent-mindedly. That's when she saw him. A man sat alone beneath a broken bus stop. His coat was soaked. The cold wind pushed the rain against his face. Yet he didn't beg. He didn't call out to anyone. He simply sat there, quietly watching the world pass him by. Something about him caught Victoria's attention. She couldn't explain it. It wasn't pity. It wasn't guilt. It was a strange feeling she had never experienced before. James noticed where she was looking. "Don't worry about him, Miss Hayes," he said gently. "He's there almost every evening." Victoria frowned. "You've seen him before?" James nodded. "Many times." She continued staring through the rain-covered window. Then, as if he sensed someone watching him, the homeless man slowly lifted his head. For just a brief moment, their eyes met. The traffic light turned green. Cars behind them began sounding their horns. But Victoria didn't move. She kept looking at the man beneath the bus stop. Then she quietly said 3 words. "James, pull over." James looked at her through the rear-view mirror. "Miss Hayes." He hesitated. "Are you sure?" James slowly pulled the SUV to the side of the road. The rain continued pouring over the quiet London street. Before anyone could say another word, Victoria reached for the door handle. Her assistant, Emma, looked at her in disbelief. "Miss Hayes, please don't do this," she said. "We don't know who he is." James nodded in agreement. "It could be dangerous." Victoria paused for a moment. Then she looked back through the window at the man beneath the bus stop. "He doesn't look dangerous," she said softly. "He looks alone." Without waiting for another response, she stepped out into the rain. The cold wind swept through the street as she closed the car door behind her. Her heels splashed through the puddles as she walked toward the bus stop. Alexander looked up. He watched her approach without fear, without surprise. His calm expression never changed. When Victoria stopped in front of him, neither of them spoke. For a few seconds, only the sound of the rain filled the silence. Finally, Victoria smiled gently. "Good evening." Alexander returned the smile. "Good evening. I noticed you've been sitting here in the rain." "I have. Aren't you cold?" He glanced toward the dark sky before answering. "You get used to the weather, eventually." His voice was calm, polite, and surprisingly refined. It wasn't the voice Victoria expected. She hesitated before asking another question. "Have you eaten today?" Alexander looked at her for a moment. Then he answered honestly. "Not today." Victoria took a slow breath. "Would you allow me to buy you dinner?" Alexander studied her face carefully. Most people looked at him with pity. Some looked at him with disgust. But this woman looked at him with respect. For the first time in a very long time, someone was speaking to him as though he still mattered. After a long silence, Alexander gave a small nod. "I'd like that." Neither of them realized that one simple invitation was about to change both of their lives forever. Victoria opened the rear door of the SUV. "Please," she said with a warm smile. "Get in." Alexander nodded politely and climbed inside. James and Emma exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them said a word. As the SUV pulled away from the roadside, silence filled the car. Raindrops tapped softly against the windows. Alexander looked outside, quietly watching the city pass by. A few minutes later, James took a shortcut through one of London's busiest streets. Alexander suddenly spoke. "The next junction will be blocked." James frowned as he glanced into the rear-view mirror. "What? If you continue this way," Alexander said calmly, "you'll lose at least 20 minutes. Take the next left." James almost laughed. "I've been driving these roads for 15 years. Victoria remained silent. She wasn't sure why. But she said, "James, take the left." He reluctantly obeyed. Less than a minute later, emergency vehicles rushed past the road they had avoided. Traffic behind them came to a complete standstill. James stared at the road ahead in disbelief. "How did you know that?" Alexander smiled faintly. Sometimes, paying attention is more valuable than being in a hurry. No one spoke for several seconds. When they arrived at a quiet restaurant, Emma opened her tablet to check the latest update on the Westbridge contract. She sighed. They've rejected our revised proposal again. Alexander glanced briefly at the screen. You revealed your strongest offer too early, he said calmly. Emma looked up, surprised. What do you mean? They're negotiating from confidence because they believe you're afraid to lose them. Victoria leaned forward. Alexander continued. If I were in your position, I would let them wait. Emma frowned. And if they walk away? Alexander met her eyes. They won't. His answer came without hesitation. Without doubt. Victoria studied him carefully. This was no ordinary homeless man. The question was no longer whether Alexander was hiding something. The question was, what was he hiding? Dinner ended just before 10 o'clock. Throughout the meal, Alexander spoke very little. He was polite to the waiters. He thanked them each time they brought food. He never asked for anything extra. Victoria couldn't stop noticing the small details. He held his knife and fork with perfect etiquette. He spoke with quiet confidence. And every answer he gave was thoughtful. Nothing about him matched the life he appeared to be living. As they walked back to the SUV, the rain had finally stopped. Victoria turned to him. Alexander, where will you sleep tonight? He looked down the empty street and smiled faintly. I'll find somewhere. You mean, back at the bus stop? It has sheltered me before. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment. Then she made a decision. You don't have to go back there. Alexander looked at her. You can stay in my guest house for as long as you need. Emma's eyes widened. Miss Hayes. Victoria gently raised her hand. It's okay. James unlocked the SUV, still unsure whether this was the right decision. A few minutes later, they arrived at Victoria's home. Alexander stepped out slowly and looked at the beautiful house. There was no excitement on his face. No amazement. As though luxury meant nothing to him. Victoria noticed. Most people would have been overwhelmed. Alexander simply smiled and said, You have a beautiful home. She smiled back. Thank you. As they walked inside, neither of them noticed. A black sedan parked across the street. Inside it, a man lowered a camera. He had just taken several photographs of Alexander. He picked up his phone. I've found him, he said quietly. Alexander Sterling is alive. Then he ended the call. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Victoria's home. For the first time in months, Alexander woke up in a warm bed. He quietly made it, folded the blanket neatly, and walked downstairs. In the kitchen, Victoria was preparing breakfast. She looked up and smiled. Good morning. Good morning, Alexander replied. I hope you slept well. I did, thank you. As they sat down to eat, Emma walked into the dining room carrying her tablet. She looked surprised. You're already awake. Alexander smiled politely. I've always been an early riser. Emma placed the tablet on the table. Miss Hayes, Westbridge has requested another meeting this afternoon. Victoria sighed. They still want us to lower our price. Alexander remained silent, listening. After a moment, he calmly said, If they requested another meeting, they're no longer negotiating from strength. Emma looked at him. How do you know that? Because if they truly wanted to leave, they wouldn't be coming back. Victoria stared at him. Once again. His answer sounded less like an opinion. And more like experience. Just then, the house intercom rang. James answered it. A security officer's voice came through. Miss Hayes, there's an elderly gentleman at the gate. He says he's looking for a man named Alexander Sterling. The room fell silent. Emma slowly turned toward Alexander. Victoria's heartbeat quickened. Alexander closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, he whispered. I knew this day would come. For the first time, Victoria realized. The man sitting at her dining table wasn't simply hiding from poverty. He had been hiding from his past. Victoria looked at Alexander. You know him, she asked quietly. Alexander remained silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded. I do. James escorted the elderly gentleman into the living room. The moment he saw Alexander, he stopped in his tracks. His eyes filled with emotion. Mr. Sterling. Alexander stood up. It's been a long time, Richard. Richard lowered his head respectfully. I've been searching for you for almost 5 years. Victoria and Emma looked at each other in shock. 5 years? Richard turned toward Victoria. Miss Hayes, do you know who this man really is? Victoria slowly shook her head. Richard took a deep breath. The man you welcomed into your home was once one of the most respected businessmen in Europe. He built companies that employed tens of thousands of people. He advised governments, invested in struggling businesses, and quietly donated millions to charities without asking for recognition. Emma could hardly believe what she was hearing. But why would someone like him end up living on the streets? The smile on Richard's face disappeared. Because money couldn't protect him from heartbreak. The room fell silent. A few years ago, Mr. Sterling lost his wife after a long illness. He never recovered from that loss. Not long afterward, people he trusted betrayed him. Business partners fought over his companies. Even members of his own family cared more about his fortune than they cared about him. Richard looked at Alexander before continuing. So he disappeared. He handed over the management of his businesses to a trusted legal team, left his wealth untouched, and walked away from the life everyone envied. Victoria couldn't find the words to speak. She finally understood. Alexander hadn't been running from poverty. He had been running from pain. And in trying to escape a world that valued his money, he had been searching for someone who would simply value him as a person. The house was unusually quiet. Victoria sat alone in her study, thinking about everything Richard had revealed. She finally understood why Alexander never complained. Why he never asked for money. Why he seemed completely untouched by luxury. He had once owned everything most people spent their lives chasing. Yet none of it had saved him from losing the people he loved. A gentle knock came at the door. It was Alexander. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he said. Victoria smiled. Not at all. Please, come in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria finally asked the question that had been on her mind all day. Why didn't you tell me who you really were? Alexander looked out the window before answering. Because I wanted to know if anyone could still see the man, without seeing the fortune. Victoria lowered her eyes. I didn't help you because I thought you were rich. I know, Alexander replied with a gentle smile. That's why I'll never forget what you did. Before either of them could continue, Emma rushed into the room. Miss Hayes. Victoria stood up immediately. What happened? Westbridge has arrived. They've moved today's meeting forward, and they're waiting in the boardroom. An hour later, Victoria sat across from the Westbridge executives. The negotiations began. Once again, they demanded lower prices and stricter conditions. This time, Victoria remained calm. She remembered Alexander's advice. She closed the file in front of her. If those are your final terms, she said confidently, then I'm afraid we can't accept them. The room fell silent. For several long seconds. No one spoke. Then the chairman of Westbridge leaned forward. He smiled. Perhaps, we can discuss another solution. Victoria realized something in that moment. Alexander had been right all along. Sometimes, the greatest strength in business is knowing when not to give away your value. The meeting ended with handshakes. Westbridge agreed to a revised partnership. Hayes Group had secured its biggest contract of the year. As Victoria left the boardroom, Emma hurried toward her with an excited expression. Miss Hayes, you need to see this. She handed Victoria her phone. Every major news outlet was carrying the same headline. Business legend Alexander Sterling reportedly found alive after 5 years. Victoria looked at Alexander. He wasn't surprised. He simply took a slow breath. I knew this moment would come. Within hours, reporters gathered outside Victoria's home. News vans lined the street. Cameras waited at the front gate. No one knew how the story had reached the media. Richard looked at Alexander. You can't hide anymore. Alexander nodded. I never intended to hide forever. The following morning, he stepped outside. The flashes from hundreds of cameras lit up the street. Questions came from every direction. Mr. Sterling, where have you been? Are you returning to business? Is it true you lived as a homeless man? Alexander raised his hand. The crowd became quiet. For a moment, he looked at the faces before him. Then he spoke. I didn't leave because I lost my fortune. I left because I lost my faith in people. The reporters listened in complete silence. But one person reminded me that kindness still exists. He turned toward Victoria. She didn't know my name. She didn't know my past. She didn't know my wealth. She simply chose to help a stranger. Every camera turned toward Victoria. She smiled modestly but said nothing. Alexander looked back at the crowd. The greatest wealth in this world isn't money. It's finding people who see your humanity before they see your success. For the first time in years, Alexander Sterling felt that he had finally come home. The noise of the crowd slowly faded. Reporters were still outside, but inside Victoria's home, everything felt strangely peaceful. Alexander stood by the window, watching the world he had once left behind. Victoria joined him quietly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria finally asked, "What happens now?" Alexander smiled faintly. "Now, I stop running." She looked at him. "You never looked like someone who was running." He nodded. "Because running doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes, it looks like silence." A pause followed. Victoria lowered her voice. "You could go back to everything you had before. Your companies, your life, everything." Alexander shook his head slowly. "I already had everything once." He turned toward her. "And it didn't save me from losing what mattered most." The room went quiet again. Then he added, "But I think I understand something now." Victoria waited. "That money isn't what makes a life valuable. It's people." Outside, the London sky began to clear for the first time in days. Weeks later, a new foundation was announced across the UK. The Sterling Hayes Foundation. Its mission was simple: helping homeless people rebuild their lives with dignity, education, and opportunity. At the opening ceremony, cameras flashed again. But this time, Alexander didn't stand alone. Victoria stood beside him. Not as a CEO. Not as a billionaire. But as someone who had learned something far more important. Alexander leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "You know, that night in the rain changed everything." Victoria smiled. "I thought I was just helping a stranger." He nodded. "You were." A pause. Then he added softly, "But sometimes, strangers are just people waiting to be seen." They both looked out at the crowd. No more secrets. No more hiding. Just two lives changed forever by a single act of kindness. And for Alexander Sterling, the richest thing he ever found wasn't his empire. It was humanity. Moral lesson: kindness has no price, but it has the power to change lives forever. Never judge people by what they have or what they've lost. Because the person you ignored today might be the one who changes your life tomorrow. Thank you for watching.